Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our latest 101 series workshop. This month we will be repeating our Ecosocialism 101 session, which we did 4 of in 2022. Much like our other sessions that we have done in 2023, we're trying to take those old sessions that we've done, the things that we've learned from them, and pare them down so that we get down to about a 1-hour workshop. In 2022, when we started this 101 series, we repeated, Green Party 101, Ecosocialism 101, Organizing 101 every 3 months. We intentionally committed on those first workshop series that we weren't going to limit ourselves on time. So if you go to check out the series at greensocialist.net/101s, what you'll find is that the 2022 workshops were long. Most of them were 2 to 3 hours. We know that is, we knew when we were doing it that is very long for a workshop, but we did not want to, starting out, limit ourselves. So our goal coming into 2023, in addition to, breaking that quarterly repetition that we did in 2022 and introducing things like independent politics 101, decentralization 101, Green Party or Green New Deal 101, which we've done this year, we wanted to come back and repeat some of them. So we did Green Party 101 in January, got it down to an hour, got it down to a digestible form, and this month we're back to Ecosocialism 101. We chose Ecosocialism for this month because earlier in the month we had May Day, obviously, on May 1st, and then Marx's birthday on May 5th. So it seemed like a good, month to jump back into ecosocialism. So that's one thing to remember as you watch this one. If you want to, kind of get deeper into different aspects of this workshop, you can go look at our 2022s where we, were much longer. We also, in our 2022 ones, in session 2, we really focused on the question of what is capitalism. And then in session 3, we really focused in on what is socialism. So we even looked into, parts of those workshops and expanded them even more. So if you want a deeper view, you can look at those 2022s. Session 4 in 2022 looked at a huge range of people and thinkers and ideas and movements that didn't kind of fit into the formatting of the Ecosocialism 101 that we had been doing. So that's kind of like an appendix of additional stuff. And again, you can see those old workshops and see what we've got coming up next at greensocialist.net/101s. Right now, it's just me right now, Chris Blankenhorn. I'm a former ILGB co-chair, or former GPUS co-chair. I'm currently the Illinois Green Party secretary, and I am the president of the Green Socialist, or the co-chair of the Green Socialist Organizing Project, and one of the organizers of our education working group that puts on these events. Garrett may be joining us later, I'm not sure, but without further ado, I'm gonna dive right in, because like I said, this year we're trying to get the workshops that were intentionally long in 2022 down to a more digestible, kind of hour-long format. So without further ado, let's jump into our Ecosocialism 101. If you want to, if you've got questions and things as we go, I'll try to take them as we move through. So an outline of what we're going to talk about today. What is capitalism? You really can't, it's hard to talk about socialism without talking about capitalism, especially when we're in the West and we're dealing with populations that, especially in the United States, have suffered century plus of propaganda around this. Most people who in mainstream politics who you hear talk about socialism or capitalism can't actually define either. So it's important that we can talk about, what is capitalism and, give us a basis to critique and discuss the world that we exist in now. After that is socialism as an alternative and organization of society. getting into a brief outline of historical socialist ideals, Marxism, anarchism, socialist movements throughout history, green ecology, and green socialism, and then closing off with green socialism in practice and where to go next. I do want to kind of preface, this workshop by saying this workshop comes at it from a bottom left, green socialist perspective. So there are definitely other tendencies that have slightly differing perspectives, but this is coming at it from the green socialist perspective, the Green Party perspective. So what is capitalism? Capitalism is not just an economic system, but it's a whole type of society and culture, and it dominates our politics. Peter Staudenmeier defined in the essay, What is Capitalism? 4 unique characteristics of capitalism: commodity production in exchange for product, or for profit, oversized the role of markets in society and market relationships, property is a private investment, and exploitative labor, where you have no say in production or administration, right? And so that last one especially is a cornerstone of most socialist visions, excluding the new rise in popularity of the phrase democratic socialism, which more often than not actually describes capitalist social democracy, a heavily regulated form of capitalism, but not socialism, because it does not deal with the ownership of the means of production, right? It does not deal with exploitation and alienation of labor. But that gives us, kind of a baseline understanding of what makes something, capitalist. Production is guided by commodification and the strive for profit, not human need. And that ties right in with the oversized role of markets, right? The idea that, and not only in our economy, but in all of our, throughout society, the idea of our society is oriented around, profits and wealth, private wealth, that it's not, we do not live in a society, an economic system, a political system that prioritizes people and the needs of people first and foremost. It's always about making money. Property is private investment, right? That's always been a key, whether it be anarchism or Marxist thought or social ecology. Property has always been a central thing in defining capitalism and socialism. And under capitalism, property is just another commodity, just another resource. And if you look at things like our housing situation right now, right, the core problem with housing and why we have a housing crisis is that housing is a commodity. Housing is a source of investment, right? Massive hedge funds like BlackRock are, the biggest, some of the biggest landlords in the country, and so our whole society is, oriented around that private property, and our whole government, our whole system of laws is oriented around that private property perspective. And then I kind of brought the last one up top when I talked about it first, but exploitative labor, alienation of laborers from the means of production, is really the linchpin for a lot of what is capitalism, what is socialism. It's important to understand that capitalism is not government regulation, as is often represented as, right? Roads are not socialism. Fire departments are not socialism. Those are just social services. They don't deal with, exploitative labor and alienation from labor and a lack of democracy in our economic system. So I kind of touched on these a little, but there's, obviously, if we're doing a workshop on green socialism, on ecosocialism, we think that there are problems of capitalism. And I think it's important to recognize that capitalism has been 100% been a failure at addressing human needs. This has become even more obvious with the COVID pandemic exploding in 2020. But overall, and it's often one of the things that we as socialists hear, right? What if you fail? because we're proposing radical transformational system change, not just reforms and maintaining and putting capitalism on some life support and giving it some crutches to keep it alive, while also maybe, as social democrats would push for, kind of changing the distribution of wealth slightly, but not changing the fundamental characteristics of capitalism. And so often socialists are challenged, of failures of other socialist projects, of potential failures of utopian socialist projects, should they be implemented. Yet those criticisms are coming within a system that has been a 100% failure at addressing human needs, right? Massive poverty, massive social inequality, not just in the United States, but even more so when we take a global view. So some kind of manifestations of this: no right to housing, right? We've got evictions during the pandemic and during crisis, let alone during supposedly good times, right? In the United States, housing is not a right. Housing is something that you have to buy, and that's true throughout most of capitalist society. Even the best kind of alternative systems like Vienna, Austria, is often used as the gold standard of public housing, right? But even there, it's 60% of the people live in subsidized or public housing, but it's still not a right? It's still not. It still ran for profit in many ways, and so the lack of a right to shelter is not provided. There is a principal part of capitalism. No right to food, similarly, right? Our laws, our government, everything is set up to protect capital first and foremost, right? Hidden behind the flowery words of the founding documents of the United States is a system and a government, political and economic system and social system, right, that primarily concerns itself with protecting private property, with protecting the rights of landowners, with protecting oligarchs and maintaining them, right? And so we have no right to food, right? We arrest people when they starve. We make them we expect them to rely on private charities or bootstrapping. These fundamental things that are needed for survival, right? Housing, food, medicine, right to clean water, peace, lack of, these things are not provided for under capitalism. And capitalism makes no, attempt to even seem like these things are important to it. Profit is first, expansion of markets is primary. There's no right to medicine, as insulin and life-saving medicines see their prices skyrocket. Health insurance is tied to employment, and even those that have health insurance, tens of millions of them, despite having it, still can't afford it because we have commodified this essential service, this thing that everyone needs. And this is an area where, even amongst capitalist nations, right, the United States is an outlier, that we don't even provide universal health care. That's how bad it is here. And one thing I was talking the other day with Garrett about is, that tied to employment is just huge here. I think it was Obama that said that even if he could pass universal health care, he wouldn't, because he didn't want to see people leaving their jobs, right? Millions of people work their jobs solely to get that health insurance because it's absolutely unaffordable without having it provided through your work. And none of that should be, placed on us. That the taking care of the society should be the the burden of the government, the burden of society. And that's just not what we have in the United States. And it's not something that is guaranteed or even sought after under capitalism. It's much to the opposite. Similarly, no right to clean water. We've got fracking and industry destroying what little fresh water we have, right? Fresh water makes up a very, very, very small amount. Potable water, even less, drinkable fresh water of the water on Earth. So we often think about all the water that we have on Earth, but very little of it can sustain life on land. Very little of it is drinkable. And under capitalism and under capitalist means of production and capitalist, market motivations, we're seeing that water being increasingly, poisoned. We're seeing that water being increasingly commodified. We're seeing fracking around the country. We're seeing pipelines going, over and above our aquifers. We're seeing, Nestle going into, areas that have problems with water and pulling out as much as they possibly can just to bottle and sell to us. And then finally, capitalism offers no right to peace, right? Capitalism demands war and conflict, right? If our economic and social systems and political systems are guided by the demand for ever increasing markets, that means that we have a system that is encouraging conflict, right? That we have a finite number of resources on the earth. We have a finite number of markets on the earth. We have a finite amount of production that can be done, and therefore that creates capitalists think competition is a good thing, but competition is what leads to war. Capitalism is what leads to oppression and suffering. Capitalism upholds these things because it's necessary. Capitalism will always put property, profits, and market over human needs. Capitalism and the State. Eric Larson wrote a piece called "The Operating System: The Modern Theory of the State," which talks about the state as a political, social, cultural, and economic entity conceived and established by humans that controls the functions and relations of human society, the economy, and nature. In theory, this could provide some level of safety and stability and shared identity and well-being, but that's not how it works, right? And if you go back to early capitalists, right, the early liberal, traditional classical liberals, the founding people that were behind the economic and political theory of capitalism, they saw it as a way to provide a level of a safety net, to provide a shared identity, to provide for the well-being of people. But it was almost immediately, if we take those thinkers in good faith, it almost immediately showed itself to not be that, right? It almost immediately showed itself, like we said on the last slide, to always put private property, private wealth, private production over the needs of the people. And then once established, the state absorbs and regulates and extracts values from all social activities, right? Very little in our world is not commodified. We're on right now, right? We are broadcasting onto, and people are watching on social media networks, where we are actually the commodity, right? Where our data, our lives, the things that we post about, the pictures we share, all of that is actually that's the commodity that they're after. They want to know about us so they can advertise to us. And Larson said the state was the original capitalist, and it remains the greatest. It aspires to incorporate every inch and corner of society over which it presides into a vast wealth-producing machine. And a look at the United States government shows you exactly that, right? A government that is designed and strives to capitalize on every part of our society. The government does not like areas to be outside of their control. And that's not, there's obvious, manifestations of that right now, like the attack on reproductive rights, the attack on trans rights in the LGBTQI community, the attack on diversity programs, and things like that. So there's obvious parts of that on the right, but it also exists within the subjective left in the United States, which is actually the Democratic Party is actually a center right or right wing party. So there's the economics come to dominate society, and they focus on squeezing all value out for capital and the state. And we, people are worthless if we don't have economic worth. If we aren't producing, and that is very clear in our society, right? Right now, we have a debt ceiling crisis, and the Republicans are trying to attach work requirements to various social problems as part of a deal to increase our debt limit, right? So it's playing out right now. If you aren't working, if you aren't producing profits for your boss, under capitalist perspectives, you don't have any worth, and therefore don't have a right to life, don't have a right to these basic things. The state claims a monopoly on determining personhood and the use of force and violence. Absolutely true. The state is the sole purveyor of violence, right? The people rise, and that includes violence outside of just physical violence, but also economic violence and psychological and social violence. The state is the only, per capitalist thought, the only legitimate purveyor of those things. Should we stand up for ourselves, then we are being violent, and that is not okay. But when the state does it, when the state cracks down, when the state has oppressive laws and things like that, then it's okay, because it's the state. The state is taking a totality of our society. And then Larson identifies 6 evolutions of the state. The modern neoliberal and social democratic states grew out of the nation state, which grew out of monarchies and commercial oligarchies, right? So, and this, Marx talks about this too, right? The ever stepping, evolution of how we get to capitalism. And it's almost, Marx is to the point that with these steps, that there are, he felt that capitalism was almost essential to lead us to socialism. We needed that. It was part of the process. But capitalism and the state evolved in tandem, to extract more and more and maintain, a resistance to revolutionary action. The state provides that centralized power to defend capitalism. Some myths about capitalism. 7 left myths about capitalism by Blair Taylor explore some common misconceptions that happen on the center left of progressives and things. Greed caused this, right? The idea that greed is behind this. It's not capitalism that's the problem, it's greed that's the problem. But capitalism requires greed. Capitalism requires ever increasing profits in markets. It's a pressure to grow or die. It is not a aberration of capitalism. It's actually the design of capitalism. And similarly with corruption, right? You hear this a lot where people use the term crony capitalism. It's just capitalism, right? Of course, people in power are going to abuse said power. It's not that we have bad leaders, but we certainly do have bad leaders, but we have a bad system, right? It's rotten to the core. Our political, our economic, our social system is absolutely, rotten to the core. It's not that it was corrupt, that greedy corruptions, caused this. It's what was designed. It's the path that's supposed to happen. That ties into, Wall Street monetary policy, which ignores the fact that systemic exploitation of labor is at the root of this, right? We can't get, overcome these things if all we're going to do is make some monetary policy tweaks, or all we're going to do is put some regulations in place. Big corporations, similar, this all comes into if you've kind of been around progressives and left liberals, this is what you hear, right? It's not capitalism, it's greed, it's corporations, it's Wall Street. And the problem with big corporations is, it doesn't recognize that small businesses also, fully exploit labor. I can say, having worked for numerous small businesses, often they're the worst, right? Because at least at your Fortune 500 company, there's some level of usually rules and policies and procedures, and HR doesn't work for the employees, but there is something there. Having worked for numerous small businesses where there was nothing, right? When your boss is the one that's exploiting you, when your boss is the one that's treating you poorly, when the owner is the one who is the source of the problem, there's no outlet but to leave, right? This isn't a problem of big or small capitalism. This is a problem with capitalism. And then there's the conspiracy side, right? If we and part of this conspiracy side is that capitalism is a big problem. It's a total problem, right? We talked about that with the state. The capitalism has reached a level of totality. And this is one of the reasons why Marxism isn't something that started and ended with Marx, but it's a long tradition, and it's a process more than an ideology. Is understanding that this, and kind of grasping at this very nebulous giant thing is hard, right? So it's a whole lot easier. It's a whole lot easier to say, oh, this conspiracy theory explains it, right? This bad actor explains it. That's just, it's ignoring the root cause. It's looking for simple solutions. It's looking for silver bullets. And that doesn't get us anywhere because it ignores the systemic nature of capitalism. In recent years, we've heard, take back America and return to normalcy. But that's propaganda. That's looking at a history that's not true. That's looking at a history that was still oppressive, repressive, in many ways worse, right? There is no going back to something better. There is no, there is no bright and sunny time of the past where these problems weren't just as real. We can't pretend like that. Look, we need to go backwards into a different form, a different manifestation of capitalism. What we need to do is break from capitalism. And then the idea that we can build full alternatives to capitalism now, right? That this is something that can happen overnight. But we have to address that we're dealing with a total system, right? We're dealing with something that has its, claws in every aspect almost of our being, that there's very few places where capitalism isn't, a major part of it. And so we have to understand this when we come at it, right? We have to understand that this isn't just a political fight. This isn't just an economic fight. This isn't just a social fight. This is a total fight, and we need to, build our organizations and build our movements and plan our strategies accordingly. We need a left analysis of capitalism, is what Blair Taylor said. An analysis of capitalism that helps us determine a path forward. The left has no monopoly on critiques of capitalism, and given its present historical weaknesses, there's a great danger for a rise in reactionary forms of capitalism, right? With the increasing of the climate crisis, we're going to see a lot more eco-fascism rising, right? We're going to see a lot of, we're worried about, even where it's going to get to the point where even the far right can't deny the climate crisis and the danger that's looming. And as such, they're going to use that to justify more oppression, to justify, more in and out, to justify more consolidation of wealth at the expense of the rest of us. Blair Taylor said, after years of neglect, the left prescriptions on the economy have become vague, opportunistic, lacking vision. Many simply nod along to recycled Keynesian solutions and fail to explain why social democracy was steamrolled by neoliberalism in the first place, right? Even when you look at, the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and the social democratic states that exist in Europe and places like that, they are even losing to a different form of capitalism, right? Right-wing capitalism is bulldozing center capitalism. And in most of the world, the left is non-existent, and even more so in the United States. So we've talked about the problem, right? What's the alternative? What is socialism? According to Eugene Debs, one of the most successful, American socialist political actors in history. Well, I mean, on votes terms, which is certainly not the only metric, and should not be our only metric. Eugene Debs would be the most successful, but socialism is a theory of society in which the workers are to own the social means of production, in which the workers will use them not to produce multimillionaires or billionaires, but to fill the land with wealth so that poverty, such as we now understand it, may be abolished, right? And that's the key. That's one of the key things in the kind of goals of socialism, right? In the nuts and bolts, we talk about things like owning the social means of production, right? We talk about democracy. But when we're talking about the values of socialism, we're talking about, so that poverty is such as we understand it may be abolished. That's the goal, is a society oriented around uplifting and providing for all people. So some characteristics of socialism, ecosocialism: production to meet human need rather than profit and market-based production, which, to get the eco of ecosocialism, has to respect nature, has to be within ecological limits. And this is where ecosocialism differs from some past socialist projects, right? Early socialist projects really latched on to production, latched on to, and in many ways it was needed, right? If you look at the USSR, they were taking an agrarian society and modernizing it. So production was kind of essential to them at their place in their time. But when we look at our world now, when we look at the looming climate crisis, which is getting closer and closer to being unreversible, we really, really have to make sure that our visions of socialism are within ecological limits, are considering as part of the formula, the ecology in the world that keeps us alive. Democracy in the workplace, which is where we get to talk about social media ownership of production. Labor directly participates in decisions around production and administration. This can also apply into our societies, right? Healthcare is a great example. In the U.S. healthcare system, it is 100% guided by profit, right? That is the motive. We have hospitals closing all over and clinics closing all over the country. And so they're doing so because they can't make a profit. Serving people, healthcare is not the primary goal. And obviously, as socialists, we want worker ownership. So we want the nurses, the doctors, the techs, the front office staff to all have a voice, to all have a democratic place in determining that. But when we're talking about something like healthcare, it's not just your workplace, it's a social tool. So we also want our communities involved. We also want our communities to have a voice about what kind of services they need, where they need it. We can't just limit things to that traditional ownership in the workplace, right? We need to make sure that the patients, which is the members of the community, right, have their voice along with the workers. So we're expanding on that traditional view of socialism being worker ownership, and that's why we often say social ownership, right? The workers and the community come together to guide, not only our economy and our production, but our society. And we can achieve this through local economic planning and via community worker assemblies, often called the moral economy, cooperative commonwealth. But we do so in a way that things like healthcare are really not manageable on the local level alone, right? They require a larger scale coordination, whether that be to benefit from economies of scale and production, or other things. So we really, really need to have that democracy, not only in our workplaces, but in our communities. And, the core idea there is the commons, right? Our society, our communities, our, everything needs to be democratically governed from the bottom up by the people. And this obviously, leads to the end goal of ending exploitation and domination and liberation for all. One area where I am a pretty orthodox Marxist is that I don't believe that there is a kumbaya, peace, love, and happiness at the end of the tunnel, right? This is a process that we're always going to have to be working towards, which is why we have to have it be democratic, and that not like the democracies we see in the world right now, but true bottom up grassroots community democracy, workplace democracy, economic democracy. We're going to need that because we don't live in a static world, right? Whether that be social society or the actual nature and ecology, right? It's always shifting. We live on a dynamic planet in dynamic societies. So we have to have real, true, open, accessible, free democracy so that we can navigate these things, so that we can push towards that goal of ending exploitation and domination, so we can push towards that goal of liberation and empowerment, so we can push towards that goal of ending poverty and providing for all. If we don't have democracy, that's not going to happen. And we can see when we look at the world we live in right now, how it plays out when we don't have that. The traditional class struggle, right, is one of the traditional phrases. And the preamble of the IWW says the working class and employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things in life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the means of production, abolish the wage system, and live in harmony with Earth. By organizing industrially, we are forming the structure of a new society within the shell of the old. So even when we are, the IWW is a union, right? And it's an old radical union. But even when talking about, taking possession of the means of production and abolishing the wage system, they still had an understanding, right? Even back then, that it needs to be in harmony with the earth, right? That we're building something new. That we're not trying to reform capitalism. We're trying to end capitalism. Which brings the question that every socialist is asked, right? How do we do it? Is socialist society possible? And for 99% of human history, humans lived in some type of egalitarian, pseudo-socialist society. They didn't call it that. There was no, the philosophical and political framework for this discussion didn't, exist at the time. But when we look at societies, but pre-capitalism, even looking at something like feudalism, right? People had far more time on their hands under feudalism. Feudalism was not a good system, but there were aspects of it where people were treated more humanely, despite the massive power and economic and social inequality that existed, right? But as we continue going further back and back and back and back and back and back, right, we start to find that societies were more egalitarian, even if they were hierarchical in many ways. Societies back then understood about taking care of their own. They were designed to make sure that everyone had what they needed to get there. Peter Kropotkin talked about this in Mutual Aid, a factor of evolution, right? Throughout most of human society, mutualism and cooperation were the guiding forces. And that doesn't mean there wasn't conflict and there wasn't repression and oppression and there weren't problems, right? But mutualism and cooperation were the guiding values rather than capitalist competition and conflict. So it's important when we get asked how do we get there? Is this possible? To point out, capitalism is new. It's not inevitable. It's not natural. It, like all social systems, was created by people, and therefore it can be changed, and new systems created by people can rise in its place. And because of that, like I said earlier, socialism isn't an end goal. It's not a point at the end where we all say we've done it. Um, you know, the likelihood of humans even living long enough as a species to do that, especially given the present climate and the present state of the world, is not even on the table. So what we're talking about is a process, right? It's and that's something we have to be, as socialists, very upfront about, right? This isn't going to be overnight. This is going to be step by step, and there's going to be steps backwards. It's impossible for us to know all the challenges that we're going to face. But if we follow our values, if we focus on, solid analysis and organizing, we can prepare and we can adapt, right? Fighting for socialism is about fluidity. And I'm a big advocate right now that when we look at the state of the left in the United States, when we look at the state of the left in the West, we don't need sectarianism. We don't need, interfighting between us. We need, radical solidarity and mutual aid. We need to engage in a multiplicity of tactics. We need to, have multi-tendency operations where people work through these things, when we work through our differences of opinion, because we know capitalism is failing us. So we have to put all the tools we can on the table. We've got to try something new, and that's a key part that we had. I think really a linchpin of like getting through and breaking through in our organizing with everyday people, is to have them understand. Right, there's fear-mongering about what socialism is going to be. There's fear-mongering about failures around the way. But what we live in right now is a failure, right? Under capitalism, there's a 100% chance of failure. We're failing now. We're driving off the cliff. We're not even stepping on the brakes in the driving off the cliff. We're stepping on the gas. So failure is inevitable under capitalism. The collapse of human society, the collapse of the ecology of the earth, is inevitable under capitalist society. So, but even if there's a 95% chance of failure on, a socialist project, that's still better than 100%. So this is, that capitalism is failing us is a key part of what we have to get through to our neighbors and the people in our community when we have these conversations. And when we talk about, is a socialist society possible, we have to look at these past and present socialist projects critically, right? We have to look at what they did right, what they did wrong, what the conditions they faced that caused something to go right or wrong. We should not be trying to recreate a movement from 100 years ago, that no longer exists, right? That failed, and there's many reasons that these projects have failed in the past, and a big part of it is capitalist repression. But we're going to have to overcome that repression if we're going to succeed. So we really have to look at the past, not in an orthodox way, but in an analytical way, so we can learn from successes and failures, so we can see what tools we might pick up and what tools we might leave behind. Capitalism and the state can change, right? Ursula Le Guin said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so do the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by humans. Resistance and change often begin in art, very often in our art, in the art of words." That obviously is coming from a author and an artist, but it's an important thing that this is the kind of stuff that is socialist. We have to internalize, and we have to shout from the rooftops, right? This is our propaganda. We live in capitalism, and its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings, right? Any human power can be resisted and changed. This is the core of our fight right now, right? We aren't even at the point as the left in the U.S. and the West of being able to say we can fight and resist and change. We have to convince people that can be done before we even get to the fight. So it's an important thing for us to remember as socialists as we advocate for change. We've talked kind of about those past projects, so brief history, I'm going to go real quick. But roots of modern socialist thought, the European Enlightenment from the 16 and 1700s, changed a lot of things about the way that people started thinking about society, about government. That leads into, the philosophers of that era, Kant leading into Hegel, leading into Feuerbach. And like I said with Marx, right, we should not consider these thinkers in a vacuum on their own, nor should we consider them finite points on a timeline, right? Without Kant, there would have been no Hegel. Without Hegel, there would have been no Feuerbach. Without Hegel, there would have been no Marx. Without Hegel and Feuerbach and Kant, there would have been no Marx, right? This is the time period when things like ethic and logic, dialectical thinking about and discussion of social relations start to come up in philosophy and in political thought. We've got early utopian socialists, St. Simon, Owen, Fourier, coming in later, right? So we first started thinking about things, right? Kant and Hegel were all about thinking. It wasn't about, Marx was about doing, right? Marx was about the material world. He brought in materialism, but Kant, Hegel, these are idealists. These are people who were thinking about the world and laying the groundwork that someone could analyze that and then propose a plan of action, which is where Marxism comes in, right? Karl Marx established an economic analysis of capitalism and predicted the eventual collapse of capitalism and the rise of socialism. There's the manifesto of the Communist Party, right? The blockbuster book, the blockbuster pamphlet, the blockbuster piece that most people think of when they think of Marx. And then there's the tome, right? There's the Capital, which Marx died before he finished. So the manifesto was the accessible, it was handed out on the streets and the everyday man could read it. And then Capital was the big piece of the research paper, the large piece of work. A key break with early socialists was the idea of the state, which was by some seen as something to be ended instead of being viewed as the ideal form of social organization. This was something that Marx himself struggled with, right? As things like the Paris Commune happened. And then you've got Marx and his conflicts with anti-statists like Bakunin and Proudhon. Proudhon is one of my favorite people to bring up when I talk to right-wing American libertarians. I like to ask them, so you've read Proudhon, you're a fan of Proudhon. And they usually don't even know who Proudhon is, and if they do, they get mad at me. But Proudhon is one of the coiners of the term libertarian. And Proudhon was an anti-statist, anti-capitalist libertarian. That was the word he used to define himself, as opposed to Bakunin, who used anarchist and anarchism. But Proudhon wrote a piece called "What is Property," in which he concluded property is theft. So this idea of the state was a big point of debate with these early Marxists, and it still is today. And it was even a large point of debate with Marx himself throughout his work. Of Marxist analysis of capitalism, obviously, this is oversimplified key analysis, or key elements, but the state enforces material relative scarcity for the benefit of the ruling class. The modern state republic arose from monarchy and was perfected under capitalism to indirectly manage society and the affairs of the owning class via wealth and influence. The state will always be compelled to grow wealth of the ruling class by taking more from the working class. The proletariat must gain power to stop this oppression and build a workers' state to end capitalism, and the workers' state will wither away as relative scarcity is overcome and a socialist society is created. So even Marx, right, had a love-hate relationship with the state. He recognized that a centralized strong power was going to be necessary to drive change and to protect change from counter-revolutionary actors. But at the same time, he also considered the state to be an oppressive body that would always, um, be a tool of repression against the people. So Marx called for a transitional, strong worker state. He called it the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in the end, he wanted it to wither away into a classless society. And a big, debate amongst socialists since then has been, what does that look like? What is the timeline on that, right? And we saw it in socialist projects with, the conflicts between Trotsky and Lenin and Stalin and in the USSR. So the state has a very important role in capitalism and a very important role in, our socialist analysis. Anarchists, I mentioned Bakunin and Proudhon, both mutualists and collectivists. Anarchists were calling for an end to not only capitalism, but an end to the state. And they did not want this, they did not trust the strong transitional state of Marxism. They, in many ways, history has proven them right, they believed that power corrupted, and even socialist projects would abuse the power of that state. It's important to note that often anarchism is described, kind of portrayed as chaos, as no rules, as just complete anarchy, is to use it in its corrupted, bastardized form. But what it means is no rulers. What it means is no hierarchy. It doesn't mean no rules. It means democratically decided upon rules by all. It does, it doesn't mean, no guidance, no strategy, no coordination. It doesn't mean chaos. Anarchism actually and bottom up organizing actually takes more organization. It takes more coordination to pull off. Dan Chodakov said there are three significant differences between Marxists and anarchists in the First International. One is class analysis. Both were for class struggle. They disagreed on which classes to mobilize for change, and they also disagreed on organizational form, centralized party versus decentralized, primarily around economic concerns. At that point in the evolution of socialism, and then the role of the state. Is a transitional worker state a good idea? Party politics versus movement building, right? So anarchists wanted to go straight to the people. They wanted to skip the state. They wanted to, tear capitalism and the state down, and that kind of contradicts what Marxist and more statist socialists would believe called for, where they wanted to take control of the state to implement a socialist society. So we're, a key difference between anarchism and more statist or orthodox Marxist perspectives has been that idea of the state and bottom up transition versus top down transition. Some kind of, again, all of this, we're trying to do Ecosocialism in an hour, so it's all very condensed, but we've got orthodox Marxism, Kautsky, Bolshevism like Lenin and Trotsky, libertarian Marxism like Rosa Luxemburg, Pinochet, anarchism represented by anarcho-communism with Kropotkin, and anarcho-syndicalism, which was more worker and employment-based by Rocker. Post-Marxists like Gramsci, Adorno, and Horkheimer, and then the idea of the debate, like I said, of socialism from above or below. And one of my favorite ways to talk about Marxism and kind of illustrate its process, right, is at the time of Marx, and why Marx has this, very big focus on the state, is that there wasn't only he was from Germany. There wasn't only a solid German identity that was very distinct from an English identity or a Belgian identity or a French identity, there was a multiple distinct, you know, German cultures. This is pre-unification, and so Marx really didn't quite, you know, he didn't quite have the opportunity to envision globalized capitalism, right? He was seeing capitalism rise in these individual states, but that didn't maintain, right? And it didn't even maintain through his life. He even started seeing it. But then we get into post-Marxist. So you've got Gramsci, who introduces the idea of hegemony, who introduces, the idea that that starts getting into the what happens when capitalism starts merging with culture, right? And Marx saw capitalism merging with the state, but in Marx's time, there was still very much distinct cultures under this capitalism. When by the time Gramsci was writing in the early 1900s, capitalism had really started integrating itself into a global capitalist culture, which Gramsci introduced the word hegemony to talk about. And then you bring in Adorno and Horkheimer, who talk about the culture industry, right? And where Gramsci kind of saw the initial integration of the state, of culture in the state, Adorno and Horkheimer saw that, when they were writing, saw the full commodification of culture, right? To the point that they called it the culture industry. And then you bring in someone like Guy Debord, in the 60s in France, and talking about the society of the spectacle, and how capitalist culture has not only become a total thing, but it's created this myth, this bauble of itself, this veil that it hides behind, this propaganda that people take as reality. And they can't even see the truth of what capitalist society is in. And then post-Marxism really explodes, right? You've got people like Julia Kristeva bringing in psychology into it. You've got Angela Davis and the Black Panther Party bringing in race, right? You've got early LGBTQ people coming in and introducing that, identity stuff. And so this period of time with post-Marxists is when you really see it explode. You really see, socialist and Marxist thinkers trying to grapple with this totality that at the time of Marx didn't exist, right? That the time of Marx was just kind of a distant thing that you might be able to see with some insight. But by the time you reach the post-war period, by the time you get to the civil rights movement, we have this massive explosion of post-Marxism, which isn't to say that Marx is left behind, but Marx needed augmented. Marx needed, Marx's kind of analysis needed integrated with a racial analysis, with a social analysis, with a psychological analysis, which with a gender and sexuality analysis, with an able disability and able-bodied analysis, with all of that. And so that's another important reason why we shouldn't talk about Marxism and socialism as a solid single ideology with a beginning and an end, but a process. In the U.S., we had many socialist and communist parties formed in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And they were extremely successful. Right, labor, modern liberal to literally even right wing, where we have right wing labor unions, which is baffling, but the modern liberal labor union likes to take credit for the 8-hour workday, but those labor unions back then were communists, were anarchists. That's who fought in the streets and won the 8-hour workday, right? That's who was at the Haymarket in Haymarket Square when the bombs went off, right? That's who was executed before the bomb was going off, even though none of them threw the bombs, right? And so in the early days of this movement in the United States, socialism and socialist, communist, and anarchist movements, organizations, leaders played a big role in gaining, a lot of the things that we have now that have been eroded or we haven't improved on since. The Socialist Party was the most successful kind of manifestation of this. It elected thousands to local, state, and even Congress. Eugene Debs is a presidential candidate, got over 1 million votes. And an important part of it is it's the only significant left third party in America that was based on a dues paying membership organized into local chapters. It was necessary if it was absolutely necessary if working people were to have labor unions and political parties that they controlled them with the resource and they provided the resources needed for effective action. It was the only way working people could compete politically with the old top-down elitist parties, which had evolved earlier out of legislative caucuses that were funded by rich sponsors, right? We have to fund ourselves, right? And when we look at things like progressive Democrats, the Squad, we see what happens when you take, even nominally left ideas and enter into a capitalist political party. You see those ideas watered down. You see those ideas repressed. You see those ideas silenced, because when you attempt to create change, to take power from within a capitalist entity, you're under the control of capitalists, right? They have veto power. They can stop funding you. So if we want an alternative, we need it to be bottom up. We need it to be of the people, for the people. And that means we need, our organizations to be organized as such. We cannot, keep following the sheepdogs into capitalist politics where all of our energies are lost in the sauce and all of our energies are just dissipated into nothing. Obviously, Debs ran in that historic race from prison. He was jailed for speaking out against World War I. The Republicans and Democrats joined forces to suppress the Socialist Party and make it more difficult for independent politics. And many socialist parties effectively disbanded during this time, right? This is kind of the first Red Scare. And this is also a time when you see, with the rise of FDR and the New Deal and World War II, labor unions shifted substantially to the right and backed the war. They abandoned their worker focus for a focus on nationalism, and it pretty much ended the days of the mainstream, radical labor union. And then at the same time, you see workers around the country being repressed, worker movements and strikes around the country being put down violently. I live maybe 20 minutes from the location of the Battle of Verdun, where miners were violently repressed in their strike. And I live about 40 minutes from Mother Jones' grave, who was a consummate advocate for workers during those times. But with the rise of the New Deal coalition, and the kind of centralization of a lot of the labor unions into what we now see as the AFL-CIO, we saw a lot less radical movement from the labor sector, and it got co-opted and sucked into the Democratic Party. By the 1950s, we were starting to talk about ecological impacts of capitalism, right? It's depressing and mind-blowing to look back today and see think that we've had 70 plus years that we've known what we're doing and we've never taken action to reverse course. But by the 1950s, we were starting to they were clear, we were recognizing them. But even socialist organizations were still caught in this production mindset, this domination mindset. And Murray Bookchin, who is a big influence on the Green Party, and was a member of the Left Green Network and involved in the party in its early days, attempted to take a synthesis of anarchist and Marxist thought, and combine it with a better understanding of human ecology and our relationship with nature, and created an ideology called social ecology. And the key idea behind social ecology is all environmental problems are at their heart actually social problems. Domination of nature by man comes directly from hierarchical culture in which man dominates man. And so that was a big turning point where we start to see the left engaging with the idea of ecology and the impact that our societies have on the earth. Social ecology draws from the past, the present, and the future to develop an ecological libertarian socialist framework. It looks at the past to understand how hierarchy arose and how past movements dealt with it, whether that be successes or failures. It looks at the present to see how capitalism works now and how we need to organize against it, right? When we're engaged in these struggles, we have to be engaging in a way that addresses the material reality of the world today. We have to be engaging in problems that arise and how they manifest today and how they manifest uniquely in our own communities, right? If you live in, California versus Pennsylvania, what the climate crisis looks like is very different, right? What environmental, destruction looks very different. What environmental racism looks very different depending on whether you're in Chicago or in Pittsburgh or in Standing Rock, right? We really have to look at the present and use it and strategize on how we deal with the material reality of the world now. And then we have to envision a future communalist society that can grow out of that, right? We have to have that present to know where we're standing, to know where our feet are at, to know the lay of the land so that we can plot the next step towards envisioning and achieving that socialist society, which social ecology says should be based on some key principles. Non-hierarchy, creating a society that's structured for equality, democracy, and freedom. Direct democracy, stateless participatory democracy via assemblies. Social justice, fighting against all forms of dehumanization, racism, sexism, etc. Ecology, human society as a sustainable and in symbiosis with the rest of nature. And what they called the moral economy, anti-capitalist and production and distribution for human needs. So this is social ecology as a big guiding principle of the Green Party. It was big in our founding. Like I said, Bookchin was actually a member. Dig Dug asked when anti-capitalism and socialism were added to the Green Party platform. That was 2016 that we explicitly didn't put in our national platform that we are an anti-capitalist party. But if you look at the Green Party's founding values, the 4 pillars, the 10 key values, what you'll see is that we've always been socialist, right? Socialists have been a major faction within the party since its founding. But when you look at our 4 pillars, ecology, obviously capitalism can't is not ecological. Peace, capitalism leads to war and destruction. Social justice, capitalism relies on othering and division, and oppression of one group over the other, and the privileging of one group over the other to maintain its power. And then democracy, nothing about capitalism is democratic, right? Capitalism is by definition an anti-democratic, hierarchical society or hierarchical system, and it's a total system at that. So while the Green Party was not necessarily explicit in its socialism and its anti-capitalism, for a long time, if you read our values, if you looked at our values and you paired them all, you compared them to capitalism, what you would find is that whether we said it or not, socialism was the driving force and the driving vision. In recent socialist history after World War II, there were efforts to recreate the Socialist Party. There was a Labor Party, but old Labor parties and syndicalists got pulled into the Democratic Party. Michael Harrington split from the Socialist Party to form DSA, which is a wing of a front group essentially for the Democratic Party, and then to this day has not broken from them. It is a major point of debate in DSA, but it is one in which the Democrats have continued to win. The New Left shifted towards more anarchist thought. People discovered people like Kropotkin, Bakunin for the first time, and then Murray Bookchin and social ecology started coming. And then the Green Party founding in the 1980s was directly out of the the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement. And if you want to know more kind of about that evolution of the Green Party, go to greensocialist.net/101s, or scroll through our YouTube and find our Green Party 101 from January, and we get it way more into depth on the evolution of the Green Party, where we came from, what we believe, how we got here. A key thing to understand about the Green Party is that we're a multi-tendency party. We have Marxists, we have Maoists, we have MLMs, we have anarchists, we have ecology people, we have deep ecology people. There are liberals, there are libertarians, right? But it's a multi-tendency organization. Green socialism in practice, like I said, see our Green Party 101 live stream for more info on that. A key part of understanding, green visions of ecosocialism is a commitment to political independence as a core principle of our organizing. This isn't a tactical thing like it is in DSA. In political independence from the capitalist parties is essential to green socialism. A commitment to anti-imperialism is part of a global movement, not just social programs, and a commitment to socialist dues-paying membership structure instead of a donor structure like capitalist parties. Many state parties and the Green Party are dues-paying, locals as well. The National Party is not, but that is a fight that has been brewing and building and is now kind of bubbling over, where I think we're going to start to see a lot more movement on that. Organizing challenges for green socialism. What is the balance between electoral organizing, mutual aid, and workplace organizing? Like I said earlier, we need to have a multiplicity of tactics. A lot of power is sequestered in electoral politics, and that means that we can't abandon it, right? Doesn't mean it should be our primary focus, but it's something we need to engage in. Similarly with mutual aid and creating parallel power structures, we need to be working on that. We need to be working in our workplaces. We need to be working in our communities. What can we learn from municipalists and other modern movements? How do we organize as an independent party and movement while under major suppression by the ruling class? A lot of people don't understand the level of oppression that third parties face in this country. I live in central Illinois. To run for U.S. House just as an example, to run for U.S. House as a Republican or Democrat in my district, you have to collect between 750 and 800 signatures. Not by a global standard, that's high. By a subjective U.S. standard, that's not bad. To run as a green or libertarian or an independent in my same district, I have to collect over 15,000 signatures in 90 days from a largely rural district, right? They haven't said Greens can't exist, but they've created laws, they've created rules for ballot access that make it almost impossible for us to get on the ballot. In New York, where they already had one of the worst barriers in the entire country, during COVID, the Democrats attached a ballot access law to a COVID relief bill and passed it, tripling the number of signatures that were required to get on the ballot. So now in New York, to get a governor or a presidential candidate on the ballot, which is required by law in order to get recognized as a party and overcome this, they have to collect 45,000 signatures in 42 days, I believe, right? That's a massive undertaking that honestly, even parties like the Republicans and Democrats would have a hard time achieving. So we have to, really think about how do we organize? Because we can't win at the game, right? The game is rigged. So how do we organize in a way that breaks the game, that shatters the bubble, that creates a fracture in the system that gives us the opportunity to grow? And then what is the balance between decentralization and centralized planning and organizing, right? Especially now with just a matter of years left before we reach kind of a no-go point on climate crisis, right? There is a need for a centralized shift. If we wanted to do a completely anarchist, we changed the whole world through a million local movements. The time for that was decades ago. Right now, we're at a point where we spent too long doing nothing. We don't have time for a gradual shift to address the crisis. We need a rapid transformation of our society away from capitalism and towards socialism. So that's a big organizing challenge that we have to think about. And you can go back in and look at some of our past workshops like Organizing 101, where we talk about basic organizing principles to kind of answer some of these questions. If you're a Green and you're going to attend the annual national meeting this August, which is going to be remote on Zoom, I assume, I'll actually be doing a version of our Organizing 101 where we get into some basic organizing tactics. If you look at our older, at session 3 and session 4 of our organizing workshops from 2022, what you'll find is us focusing on how to rebuild a local or how to build a local on your own. So really getting into green organizing instead of just broad organizing theory. So with that, I'm a little over an hour, but that's a very quick, a very crunched, discussion of Ecosocialism 101. Like I said at the beginning of the workshop, you can go to our website, greensocialist.net/101s, and see longer versions of this. In 2022, as I said, we were committed to not limiting ourselves on time. So what I just did in about an hour, we took 3 hours on. And then in sessions 2 and 3, we'd spend large chunks of time on what is capitalism, and then a large chunk of time on what is socialism. Obviously, what I talked about today was, an incomplete listing and, a very abridged version. But if you go and look at our session 4 of Ecosocialism 101 from 2022, we did a massive dump of movements, ideas, thinkers, projects, that kind of didn't fit into the framework of how we formatted this workshop. So, there you can go and we talk about people like the Zapatistas, which if you haven't read the Zapatistas' Principles for Organizing, absolute fire, right? Like some of the best organizing principles I've ever heard. So this is why we've got to look at these, other projects and learn as best we can. I'm not sure. We haven't decided what we're going to do on our 101 next month. I will say we're working on some workplace organizing stuff right now. Part of it is like a big multi-part, probably 4 to 6 workshops going into different areas of workplace organizing. But another part of it is going to be a 101 that gets a little bit into unionizing, but also gets into just kind of know your rights, right? I don't know if anyone else is on Reddit, but if you go to the anti-work subreddit on Reddit, you'll see is that a lot of people just don't know the basics. So I don't know whether it'll be next month, but we will have a workplace rights, workplace organizing 101 coming up. Like I said, in August, I'm going to do the organizing one at the Green Party's annual national meeting. So, if you like what we're doing, if you want to get involved, you can go to greensocialist.net. You can sign up to be a member. You can sign up just to get email updates. You can come on our monthly meetings where we talk about, what we're working on and we strategize. If you want to work on education stuff with us, like these 101s, we can get you plugged into that working group. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good night. We'll see you next month.